Let it go, make my body go, make our bodies higher and higher.
One of Excel's most powerful functions is called the if function. It's almost programming-like in nature, and it opens the door to a different way of thinking. The if function is a conditional kind of function. It allows us to come up with multiple answers based on a condition. In column G, in this worksheet called if function, or in the workbook 10, if VLOOKUP COUNTIF. In cell G4, we're going to apply a shipping charge. If the subtotal in column F is over 1,500, we want that shipping charge to be forgotten. In other words, no shipping charge. Otherwise, it's going to be 2%. So we want a formula in G4 that checks the data in F4. If it's greater than 1,500, the shipping charge is 0, otherwise it's 2%. In column H, we've got a total that's adding these two columns, even though for the moment, column G is empty. So we see where we're getting the same number there. Now, column G does not really have to be made wider, but in order to see the function, I'm going to make column G wider, and also at the bottom of the screen, lower right-hand corner, click the plus on the slider bar, zoom in a bit. There we go. I'm going to be using the if function here, and then down the entire column. The if function begins with equal if, a condition. And many times we're simply comparing two cells, or a cell with a formula, or a cell with a value. In this case, it's a cell with a value. We're simply about to say if this cell F4 is greater than, this is the greater than symbol. On most keyboards, that's 2 to the right of the letter M. If it's greater than 1,500. Now, you want to be clear when you do this, what if it's 1,500 exactly? If you want to make sure that 1,500 exactly doesn't get the charge, then you want to put an equal sign in here as well. And we read this as if F4 is greater than or equal to 1,500. Notice that below this, we see the highlighted pop-up tip here that says logical test. As soon as I put the comma at the end here, notice how the focus shifts over to value if true. We're now going to put in two different results. When this is true, our answer is 0, comma. When it's not true, in other words, if it's under 1,500, we put in 2%. And in this case, we're going to be multiplying it by the subtotal, asterisk subtotal, the F4 amount. A right parenthesis doesn't need to be typed here. Excel will take care of that for us. I'll press Control-Enter. There we are, it's $29. And by double-clicking the lower right-hand corner, this gets carried down to the bottom. And you can see that the totals on the right have been adjusted. That's adding the two numbers. Once again, let's look at the formula here, and I'll make the column even wider so you can see it more clearly. Double-click. There it is. Many times the if function is simple and straightforward the way it is here. Now, the company might change its mind and say something like this. We're going to have a lower percent here if the amount is over 500, but under 1,500. So, the logic of the if function actually works left to right. When this is true, the answer is 0, and the logic stops, and that's it. But what if the number is 600 or 300 or something like that? We can also put in another if, and that raises the complexity of this, although, after a while, it doesn't appear to be too complex if you work with these frequently. So what we're about to say is, if the number isn't 1,500 or more, let's put in another if to see if that subtotal is greater than or equal to 500. And if it is, comma, we'll put in 1% times F4, comma, and if it's not, we'll put in 2% F4. In other words, if it's below 500, it's going to be 2%. So anything above 500. Now, what we're keeping an eye on, perhaps, is what we see in row 5. You see a number down there just below it. Now, this is an if inside of an if. It raises the complexity level, as I suggested. And ultimately, you can put in lots of nested ifs, but that's not really a goal and shouldn't be. I need another right parenthesis on the right-hand side. And as I press Enter here, we haven't copied this down just yet, but I'll copy it down just one cell here to see the difference. This is above 500, so instead of the 1320, we're going to see a number roughly half of that. And there it is, 660. So, it's a more complex use of if. I'll make the column even wider. Double-click right here to expose it again. So, once again, and in English, we're saying the following. If the number to the left here, the subtotal, is greater than 1,500, we're going to put in a shipping charge 0. But if it's not, in other words, if it's below 1,500, we're going to be checking to see if it's 500 or more. If that's the case, the shipping charge will be 1% of the subtotal. If it's below 500, it's going to be 2%. And we complete that. And we would eventually copy this down the column, and we can do that pretty fast by double-clicking. And we've got all of our formulas in place. And then we can simply click the boundary between columns G and H. This is a simple example, although the second portion of it got a little bit more complex. The if function. It's a powerful tool. It allows us to come up with multiple answers. An important and powerful function in Excel is called VLOOKUP. Think of V for vertical. There's a companion function called HLOOKUP. Think of H for horizontal. We're looking at a worksheet called VLOOKUP approximate. There are two major kinds of VLOOKUP uses. One for approximate matches, one for exact matches. On this worksheet, we're about to put in a reduction percentage in column E. There's a table off to the right in columns H and I. It could be on another worksheet. In our example, it's on the current worksheet. And by looking at it, you probably have an idea already as to what it's going to do. Based on the subtotals that we see in column D, we want to calculate a reduction rate. The subtotal for cell D2 is 1363. Now, different people might read this differently, but the way the VLOOKUP function is going to work is it's going to be comparing that value with different values in the left column of this table. And if we have not reached this 1500 level, then the percent below will apply, 3%. So we're going to be reducing this amount by 3%. Now, lookup tables, as this might be called, it's not an official name, can exist in various forms. They might have 3 columns, 4 columns, many columns. Sometimes tables are structured horizontally. Now I could take this data right here, copy it, Control C, and down here, by using a special right-click, paste special, there's an option here called transpose. If the data looked like this, we would be using a function called HLOOKUP if we wanted to look up data in it. If you're laying out a table for lookup purposes, it's probably more common to see data in columns. It tends to be more compact and it's easier to read. But again, nothing wrong with this other table. Now, this function called VLOOKUP can also let us compare large lists with other large lists. So it's not exclusively designed to work just with small tables. But in our example, that's what we'll be using. By definition, a VLOOKUP function allows us to compare a value with the left column of a table. And then, depending upon how that value falls into place, we can gather data from other columns in the table. And so ultimately what we're trying to get here is a 3% for this particular number. For the next number, as you look at the table, it has not reached the 2500 level, therefore it will be 6%. So I'm going to use the VLOOKUP function here. It can be used in 2 major ways, as I've said. This is called an approximate lookup, because the numbers we're looking at here do not have to match up exactly with these. Now, maybe 1 or 2 of them might, and that's okay, but they don't, for the most part, line up exactly with those numbers. I'm going to make column E wider. This is not truly necessary, but as I'm typing in the function, I want it to be clear on the screen. And I'll zoom in a little bit in the lower right-hand corner, clicking the plus in the zoom in slider bar. There we go, like that. And I also want to scroll a little bit to the left because we do need to see column D. When you use VLOOKUP for an approximate match, it has 3 parts to it, sometimes referred to as parameters or arguments. Here is the amount we're looking up, comma. The location of the table, it's these cells over here, comma. Now, which column of the table has the answer? If we're looking left to right at the column letters, we'd say column I. But when we use this in the formula, we refer to the columns by number. The left column, column H, is the first column. In this example, the second column is column I. We put in the number 2, not the letter I here. It's the second column where we'll get our answer. And if this is going to work properly, we're expecting to see the percent here, 3%. By the way, if that were not formatted, we might see it as 0.03, and we could format that off the Home tab with the percent. This was done ahead of time, that's why it appears that way. Now, if we're going to be copying this down the column, we need to make sure that our reference to these cells right here stays absolute. So double-clicking back in cell E2, We want this reference here to be absolute. So we can highlight it and press F4. And then enter. Still the correct answer. The formula to the right, by the way, you might not have seen it, takes the original subtotal and then multiplies it by the difference of this percent from 100. So it's reducing it by 3%. In effect, this amount here, the example, is 97%. So 97% of 1363.80 is 1322. So we are reducing these based upon the amount. And you see how the percentages change here. If the amount is under 500, it will not change at all. So if we drag this down into the fourth row here, where we have the 337, 0%, we're not reducing this at all, but the others we are. And we can quickly copy this down the column by using one of Excel's great shortcuts, double click. Copy this down the column. And we can scroll down to the bottom to see how that's working through all these if we wish. And there's also a shortcut for that too. You can press Control period. It'll take you down there and then back up top with Control period. So, this is an example of VLOOKUP being used as an approximate match. There's also one for an exact match. One other aspect about this that's important. The left-hand column of the table must be in ascending order. Now, suppose we were not paying attention to this, and maybe this entry here, by mistake, had been put in as 4,000. Now, keep your eye on column E as I press enter. Most of those percentages changed. Now, occasionally, depending upon the magnitude of the change or where it occurs, you might not see any problem with the data. So you've really got to be attentive to this idea. Always check this out. When you're using VLOOKUP for an approximate match, the left column of the table must be in ascending order. And you must cover the lowest possible entry. It's pretty obvious here. We can't have anything below 0 in these. So that's covered. That's actually a 0. On the high end, if we have a subtotal amount over there that's higher than our highest entry, it simply reverts to the 8% as we see it here. So to correct this here, I'm simply going to press Control Z, and again, keeping an eye on column E, we see how those are all adjusted. Notice the entry over here for $4,700, that's well above the $2,500. We see that it's 8%. So we don't worry about the top end. And the low end in this case we're not worried about, but if we started this at 500, in other words, if this were the location of the table, an amount over there to the left, below 500 would turn up as an error. Right here, for example, we'd get that. So this is an example of using VLOOKUP for an approximate match lookup. Excel's powerful VLOOKUP function is often used for matching up data or looking up data exactly. It also has a use, and you might have seen it in a previous movie, for an approximate match. Anytime you're trying to match up data that's text or it's an ID type number that must be exact, we use VLOOKUP in its exact match format, slightly different than the other format for approximate lookups. In this worksheet called VLOOKUP Exact, it's in the workbook 10 if VLOOKUP COUNTIF. In column H, we need to know the department for each product we have in our list. By the way, these products might look like they're repeating, but they could be of different size and or different color. And off to the right, we've got a list of all of our products, a master list, which department each one is based in, and also the category. Now, to make this a little bit more visible on the screen, I'm going to be hiding columns D, E, F, and G. For the moment, we don't need to see those. I'm going to drag across the column letters here, right-click, and hide. We can get those back later if we need them. And although column H doesn't really have to be wider, I'm going to make it wider so we can see it as we enter the formula. We don't really need to see the size and color right now either, so I'm hiding those. Often you don't need to do this if you're working just by yourself, but for presentation purposes, it's going to make some sense here. And I can make column H even wider, and then in the lower right-hand corner, on the zoom slider bar, click plus a few times. There we go. All right, we're going to use a VLOOKUP here to find an exact match. We're looking for bamboo armchair over on the right-hand side. And this is a list here of all of our different products. We simply want to know which department they're in, and possibly eventually category. So, equal VLOOKUP, left parenthesis. Here's the item we're looking up. VLOOKUP is always based on the idea that what we're looking up, we're going to be comparing with a table located elsewhere. Now, I'm using the word table in a very loose sense. Call it a list, call it just a range of cells. We've got a range of cells somewhere else. It's off to the right. and we see it's in columns K, L, and M. And it's extensive. We might add to it later, but for the moment, we can refer to it simply by its column letters. Now, we do want to be getting data out of the second column there, the department column, in our result right here. So as we refer to the table, even though the comparison will be with bamboo armchair in the left column there, we will be getting answers out of the second column. So as we refer to the table, we can simply drag across the column letters. Now, this is provided that the only things we have in columns K and L are the headings and all the individual entries below this. No numbers, nothing else in that list down below. Comma. VLOOKUP in any of its different forms always requires us to indicate which column of this table or this range of cells has the answer. And reading from left to right, column L is the second column in the table that we've indicated. So we put in the number 2. Now, this is VLOOKUP used in exact match. And when we're using it in this form, we need to have a fourth argument. So following the indicator for the column reference, we put in a comma, and notice the pop-up, false exact match. Now, that might strike you as a little strange, as it does me. Now, you can click this and tab it into place, or you can type it. False. That means exact match? Really? Well, yes, it does. Now, you can use 0 instead. False, by the way, might suggest that something failed or didn't match, but who would ever guess at first that it means exact match? I use 0 because it's less typing, and there's another function that we won't be getting into called match that also uses 0 for exact match, but you can use either one. So for the moment, I'll use false. Remember, false means exact match. We must find bamboo armchair in the list over there in column K. So as I press enter, we should get an answer. It's in the furniture department. And there we see it right down there. There it is, it's in furniture department. And because we used column references here, right here, we don't have to worry about making this an absolute address. We can just copy this down the column. We can do this quickly with double click. And we see the others there as well too. Remember, these are not truly repeats. We've hidden the columns that indicate that some of these are different sizes and possibly different colors. For picking up the category, we want to do pretty much the same thing. And I can copy this and then adjust it. I'm simply going to copy this portion of the formula. I'll press Control-C and just escape from here. Now, column H doesn't really have to be that wide, so I'll make it narrower. And in column K, we're going to do something very similar. And here, too, I'll make it wider, again, for display purposes, even wider. I'll type equal and then paste in the function as we used it before. But some adjustments are needed. What are we trying to look up? The value in A3, but now instead of looking at columns K through L, we're going to be looking at columns K through M, because we need to come up with the category from column M. So instead of the second column here, that's what the 2 means, remember, we put in 3. Third column reading from left to right. And then we put in false or 0. This time I'll use 0. Could have used it before. We can use either one. And bamboo armchair, as we look at this on the list, we're expecting to see this dining. It's in the dining category, and there we see it. And here too, we can copy this down the column. It looks as if there's a formatting feature that got copied. We can deal with that a bit later. The point is we do have the correct answers. Now, because this means exact, either 0 or false here, that means things can go wrong pretty easily. What if in typing this entry here, maybe it got copied from some other location, whoever typed it, maybe in typing it, put in a trailing space. Excel can't find that. So that's a problem. You might have to clean up your data in column A. There is a temporary workaround. It gets into a function using an additional function that you might not have heard of, but I can clean it up here. There is a function called trim, T-R-I-M. What trim does is it eliminates trailing spaces, leading spaces, but even when there are multiple spaces between words, it'll reduce those to 1. So this will work now. And I'll copy that down the column. Now, also over here, I'll introduce more spaces that are necessary. Now, by the way, the really best long-term approach here is to clean up column A rather than doing this. But we'll have the same kind of a problem there. Notice over here, these are failing too. I didn't adjust those, but I adjusted this one, and all of them in the column, and that's working fine too, even though there are extra spaces there. Remember, it's trying to compare this with entries over here in column K, and over in column K, down in row 13, we see what's happening. there are no extra spaces on the end and only a single space. So that's a big problem when you're comparing data. And when we use an exact match, remember this is 0 or false, data must match up exactly. That's what the word means, exact, and it's got to be that way. So I've seen some variations on this. For many people, using an exact match VLOOKUP is probably more common than using the approximate match. You might have seen in the previous movie how we used VLOOKUP as an approximate match. We've seen different examples in this worksheet of how to match up data from different locations. And again, I want to point out that from time to time, sometimes these lists are on different worksheets. A little trickier to work with when you're matching lists from different worksheets, but that too you can do with this VLOOKUP function. In this worksheet called COUNTIF, we're seeing a list of our products in column C. Quick look seems to indicate that there are some duplicates, but we've got different sizes based on what we're seeing in column D, also different colors. And for the year here, let's say, or half year or quarter, it's not indicated, we've got the price of each item, how many were sold, and our total revenue. And off to the left, each item we can see is in a different category. There are different categories, different departments here. Over in column J, we want to track how many kitchen items we've sold. So looking at the list over on the left-hand side, you can begin to imagine we see kitchen in column B here and there. We want our totals just for kitchen. Now, in order to make this easier to see for you, I'm going to hide some of the columns and then zoom in. So I'm going to hide columns D and E. We don't really need to see them. Drag across the top, right-click, and hide. And using the slider bar in the lower right-hand corner, I'll click the plus a few times, we'll move in here. How many kitchen items do we have? Now, off to the left, we want to be sure for the moment we're seeing column B. Makes it easier to write formulas. We need a count of the items here. The COUNTIF function is what we want to use. Equal COUNTIF. It's as if we're saying, how many kitchen items do we have? COUNTIF. Now, we're not for the moment focusing on price or anything like that, simply items that we have. COUNTIF says, where are we looking? We're looking in column B. Now we can either click column B, because there's nothing else in there except the word department and some others. Doesn't make any difference really what else is there. We're simply looking for the word kitchen. So following our designation as to where we're looking, we put in a comma, and then we're going to click on cell J4, which contains the word kitchen. If we didn't have this nearby, we could type double quote kitchen, double quote. And as I press enter here, we see that there are 45 items. And I can simply copy this down the column here. And now we have the total of the other items as well. 73 bedroom items, 40 kitchen items, 54 living room, and so on. Now, if we want to track the revenue, we can't use the COUNTIF function. It simply counts. But a companion function called SUMIF says, well, let's say it starts off from the same idea. Let's see where we have those kitchen entries and then go over and pick up the revenue from column H. So, SUMIF has 3 parameters, 3 arguments, we might say. Start with the equal sign, equals SUMIF, left parenthesis. Like before, we're going to click on column B, comma, and then again use J4 because we want to find the kitchen items. But when we do find them, then we want to move over into column H. Now, in other kinds of scenarios where you've indicated maybe cell B2 or B5 down to B300 or whatever, you want to make sure that the area that you're trying to gather the totals from is a companion area in terms of the way you've put in the address. In other words, if you refer to a column here, refer to a column over here on the right. Or if this says B2 colon B300, this should say on the right H2 colon H300 if that were the locations. So we're done here. The revenue total for our kitchen items is this, 2 million. Drag this down the column. We've got the others as well too. And we can even do this with average cost per item because there's a function called AVERAGEIF. And in order to see this, I'll make column C a bit narrower for the moment. We don't have to see all that exactly. Same general idea here, but now it's AVERAGEIF. And it too starts off like SUMIF. Once again, we're looking in column B because we're focusing on the kitchen items, comma. Now we'll refer to cell J4, kitchen items, comma. But now we want to average the average cost per item, and that's in column F. Those are the costs of each item. What's the average cost per item? And for kitchen, it's relatively low. Some of the others are going to be higher, as you might imagine. Drag this down here. So these are valuable tools. Here are the averages in each department. It's like living room, and you could imagine couches as being quite expensive. So the average item, bath is the lowest in the list. We get good, quick, valuable information. Once again, function here, average if. Looking in column B, but only for kitchen items, let's average all those items based on the data in column F. And certainly all the others here as well, same idea here, living room and so on. So these are powerful tools, the SUMIF family of functions. SUMIF, COUNTIF, average if.